Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again for our spring webinar series this evening. We're excited you're here and looking forward to tonight's presentation. This series is generously supported by the Arvin L. Gottlieb Foundation with support from Mid-America Regional Council and the Missouri Department of Conservation. And we're grateful to them for their support in making this series happen. After the program, please visit deeproots.org, where you can watch all of our previous webinars, find out where to buy native plants, or to sign up for our newsletter. If you take just a moment to locate the Q&A tool at the top or bottom of your screen as we proceed this evening, if you have questions, please try to put those in that Q&A rather than in the chat, and we will take some time at the end to address those. If you see a question that you also have, if you'd please click the thumbs up button next to that, that way we'll know which ones are the most popular questions and we can address those first when we get to the end. And we are so pleased to have David Dods with us this evening. David is an environmental scientist and engineer who specializes in using natural systems for stormwater management and pollution control. David is co-author of the Blue Thumb Guide to Raingardens, and he has taught workshops locally and nationally on landscaping for stormwater and pollinators using native plants. And we are so pleased to have him back again with us this evening. Thank you for being here, David.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here. Share screen?
Yep, you can take it away.
All right. Okay. Can you see that okay, Sarah?
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay. Thank you all for sharing your dinner hour with us tonight. Dinner and a show. You eat dinner, keep it off the keyboard, and we will try to keep you entertained and hopefully provide you with some useful information. We're going to talk about using native plants to help solve stormwater management and drainage issues in your yards and community projects tonight. As Sarah said, I am an environmental engineer, and professionally I do a lot of work with water pollution control, flood control, and stormwater management. Excuse me. So that's my background, and here we're going to try to apply some of those principles to home yards and landscapes. Topics for tonight. I'm really going to focus a lot on the stormwater piece first, because I found that the Deep Roots audiences are very knowledgeable groups when it comes to plants. So I'm going to walk you through how stormwater moves through the natural landscape to see how Mother Nature manages water. And then we'll see how that changes when we urbanize the landscape. We'll talk about erosion a little bit, and then we'll segue into how you go about choosing plants for your stormwater projects. Then I'll end up showing you a bunch of examples to hopefully give you some ideas to try out for your problems that you might be dealing with at home or other locations. Okay. There we go. I'm having trouble advancing my slides. Let's start with looking at how rainwater and then stormwater moves through the natural landscape. This is how Mother Nature manages water. And that's what we want to try to mimic in our own yards when we apply native plants to addressing our drainage problems. So there's a couple key points I'd like you to think about as we talk about stormwater and drainage tonight. This is the first, that the way water moves through the landscape is affected by the interaction between water, soil, and plants. The amount of rain that falls, whether it's a little gentle rain or a big heavy summer downpour, affects how much water we get landing on the ground. The nature of the soil and the earth, whether it's soft, fluffy, organic soil or hard, compacted, urban soil, affects how much is converted into runoff. And the density of plants in the landscape can have a big impact on how much water you get moving through your yard. So keep in mind this interaction between soil, water, and plants as we think about how to address drainage problems. And the second key point, it might sound a little simplistic, but water flows downhill. and it follows the path of least resistance. And by that, I mean, it will always flow to the lowest point in the yard. And the differences in elevation, sometimes even if they're just a few inches, can be subtle enough to direct how water flows through your yard, whether it flows towards your foundation or away from that. So that's another topic that we will come back repeatedly to in the presentation tonight. So 2 simple points to know about how water moves through the landscape. Hopefully my simple artwork here makes some sense. When it rains, you get interception. The trees will catch a certain amount of rain before it ever hits the ground. In a big forest or under a mature tree, you can stand under the tree and maybe the first 1/4 inch of rain barely hits the ground because it's caught by the leaves on the tree. So a certain percentage of rainfall is intercepted by the vegetation. If the soil is nice and organic and rich and loose and has lots of deep roots in it, a lot of the rain that falls on the ground will infiltrate into the soil, soak into the ground. And then what is not caught by the vegetation or soaked into the ground will be turned into stormwater runoff that we have to deal with. Now, if you look at the native landscape, take a look at the prairie here. Picture of a native remnant prairie outside the Kansas City area, and then a picture of prairie grass roots here. The deep, deep root systems, 10, 15, 20-foot deep roots, dense root network, lots of organic matter, lots of channels in the soil. Very, very little rain that falls on a mature prairie like this actually turns into runoff. It's just a big organic flower-filled sponge, and the rain just soaks into the soil. Very little is converted to stormwater runoff. Same thing happens in a mature native forest. The big trees intercept a lot of the rain that falls. The rich organic matter, leaf litter, humus in the soil, rich organic soil soaks a lot of the water into the ground. In a mature forest, maybe on average over the course of a year, only about 10% of the rain that falls on a dense forest like this would actually be turned into runoff. And then this is an illustration of a watershed, just meaning any drop of rain that falls on these hills or in these valleys drains down eventually to the low point in the valley. In this case, it's the lake. So when it rains on this valley, a certain amount of rain will soak into the hillside, seep its way through the forest floor until it starts coming out as a little seep or creek or wetland. A couple creeks will come together, form a stream. The bigger streams will join together to form rivers, so on and so forth. And a portion of the water that soaks into the ground actually moves downhill, down valley through the soil or through the bedrock underneath the surface as well. The groundwater movement will slowly move through the valley from high ground to low ground as well. And here's one thing to look at. Next time you're out driving around and you go through a highway road cut, glance to the side, and this is what is underneath the hillsides throughout Kansas City. Their typical bedrock around here is limestone and shale. This is mostly limestone in this picture, and it's generally fractured like this. So the water that soaks into the soil will move down into the rock and slowly move through the fractures in the rock as well. We'll come back to this later in the presentation when we talk about sump pumps and water in basements as well. But I want you to see what it looks like beneath the ground surface. And so what will happen sometimes is water soaks into the top of a hill, works its way down through the rock. Some of it goes down deep into the groundwater. Some will move laterally. And occasionally you'll see seeps on hillsides that you wonder where that comes from. It's water moving through the bedrock. The picture in the upper right is a road cut in winter where you can actually see groundwater in a way that has seeped out through the rocks in the winter, frozen, and formed the icicles here. So this just illustrates that water moves subsurface as well as through the surface. And here's a picture of a nice little valley in a nature sanctuary here in Parkville near my home, trying to show you a real picture of the illustration there. When it rains, the rain falls on the forest, soaks into the soil, slowly works its way down through the valley. And at the upper reaches of the valley, the water might start to surface in a little pool or wetland, cattail pool, like you see in the upper left. And the water there is moving very slowly. Then as the water seeps out of the low points, coming down the hillsides, the trickles from a couple pools might join together to form a creek, like you see in the lower left. And then where a couple creeks come together and form a bigger stream, it looks something like you see in the lower right. So as we think about drainage and stormwater management, I want you to look at these pictures for a moment and give some thought to what prevents erosion in the natural landscape. How does Mother Nature control erosion? As the seeps turn into creeks and the creeks turn into streams, and the flows get bigger and faster, what keeps the soil from eroding away? In the wetland up top, it's the vegetation, because the water is pretty quiet, it's moving slowly. So the vegetation itself is enough to hold the soil in place. And then when you start getting channels, creeks in the lower left, you see it's the tree roots are holding the banks in place. And you can see small stones, gravel in the bottom of the stream that helps prevent scour and erosion. And as the creek turns into a bigger stream and the flows get bigger and the water moves faster, what you see in the lower right picture is there's a mixture of plant roots, trees that fall over, logs, woody debris, and bigger rocks are required to keep the stream from eroding. So the interaction of the soil and the plants and the water all comes together to form streams and channels and hold things together without eroding away. And we're going to apply those principles in our yards a little bit later in the talk today. So now let's think about what happens when we change the landscape from prairies and forests to suburbs and cities. And the trees and the prairies are plowed up and replaced with sidewalks and roads and driveways and parking lots and buildings. How might that change how water moves through the landscape? So here's our suburban ecosystem. A little bit different from the native prairie, isn't it? And if you think about the interaction between water and earth and plants here, the trees have been replaced by roof or a driveway or asphalt roadway. The forest has been replaced by a single tree or two here and turf grass, and we've totally altered the landscape. And if you think about the other little point on stormwater, that water flows downhill, where is downhill in this picture? Water lands on the roof, drains down very quickly to the gutter, and then very quickly down the downspout, right? And then out onto the lawn or to the driveway. And beneath the lawn, this is what our soil looks like in most modern suburbs. When the forest is cleared for housing development, the topsoil is stripped with a bulldozer, so there's no rich organic topsoil left. The soil is smashed and mashed and destroyed in the process, and then it's graded over with a front end loader, and sod is thrown down on top, which generally requires you to water and fertilize forever afterwards. But you can see that the soil here is very different from the picture of the soil that I showed you earlier in the prairie or the forest. That rich, deep, fluffy, soft organic soil has now been compacted. The clay subsoil we have here is hard as a rock beneath the turf grass. So you get very little infiltration here into the ground when it rains now. So if we come back to this house, the blue arrows is sort of the drainage path. We have very little interception because there's few trees left. We have very little infiltration because the soil's been smashed into clay bricks for all practical purposes. The downspouts drain into the driveway drains into the street, and the street drains down the hill. And if your neighborhood looks like this, where do you think the water runs here? Look at this little residential watershed. You can see, especially on the left side here, the white downspouts. Each one of the houses, their downspout aims out into the backyard. There's no prairie or forest to soak up the water. The water comes off the roofs very quickly, and it's all going to flow downhill, right? Generally to the house at the bottom of the hill, and their backyard looks like this when the rest of the neighborhood drains into the unfortunate yard at the bottom of the hill. And if the neighborhood looks like this on the front side, and all the downspouts drain to the driveways, and the driveways drain to the streets, and the streets drain to the bottom of the hill, to the storm sewer at the bottom of the hill. In that case, what used to be a forest and a wetland and a creek has now been converted to a hard roof, a downspout, a hard driveway, a storm sewer, and a concrete channel. So you can imagine that in our typical Kansas City area suburbs, the water moves through the landscape much, much faster than it does through the natural environment, because we've converted much of the landscape from trees and forests and soft soil to hardscape. And just a couple calculations here give you a sense of how much water we get running through our neighborhoods in a rainstorm. And this is an easy calculation you can do at home if you're trying to estimate how much water comes off your roof. 1 inch of rain over 1 square foot is just a little over a half gallon, about 0.62 gallons. So if we have a 1 inch rainstorm on a very modest 1,500 square foot roof, that's about 900 gallons in every inch of rain we get. And on a quarter acre lot, that might be about 3,000 gallons per inch of rain running off the lot. In the summer here, we particularly some of our big thunderstorms, we can get much larger rainstorms, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inch rains sometimes. When you get a big rain like that, these numbers just skyrocket. 5 inch rain on a quarter acre lot is about 15,000 gallons of runoff. And to put that in perspective, a tank truck that you might see at a gas station is 5,000 gallons. So in a 5 inch rainstorm, a modest lot can generate 3 tank trucks worth of runoff. And oftentimes that goes out into the street like this and down into the storm sewer. And if you expand that over a 10-acre neighborhood, you get 1 million gallons of stormwater runoff in a big rainstorm, just to give you a sense of the scale of the volume of water we can get around here. And the consequences of that, unfortunately, are all too common. The low part of the neighborhood, you see flooding like this. And wherever stormwater is concentrated and drainage comes out in a defined pipe or channel, you tend to get erosion, because the high volumes of water moving at high speeds are enough to erode the soil where the water concentrates like this. So that's a good segue to talk about erosion for a moment. The picture in the upper right corner there is one of my job sites, previous job sites. That's an erosion gully. That was at the bottom of a hill where stormwater was coming off a landfill slope on very soft soil, and it hadn't been taken care of. So we had to do a lot of work to fix that problem before it got much worse. But a few things to remember at the home scale is bare soil erodes. 2 points here. Bare soil erodes even on very gentle slopes. If the soil is not protected, it will erode. This picture in the upper right, how common is that in development projects, where the typical practice is to clear cut the entire development and then put the houses up and then put the sod back in later. So even in your own yard, little patches of bare soil can erode easily if you don't keep an eye on them. The other point, the lower photo there, is even vegetated sites can erode under some conditions. If there's gaps between the plants, if there's gaps in the vegetation, if the slope is steep, which makes the water run off the landscape fast, or the soil is soft and not very compacted. In this case, this was a park project where they put a parking lot in uphill of this location. Water was draining off the parking lot. They seeded it, but they didn't get the sod established before they started getting drainage. So it just cut right down into the fairly soft soil under it before the grass got established. So bare soil erodes. Vegetated soil can erode if it's on a steep slope or there's gaps between the plants. This will become important when we talk about choosing plants in a few minutes. So the way that we tend to design drainage ditches or swales or channels to prevent erosion is there's several approaches. One that's most common with typical developments is just to sod it and put very dense turf in, because turf grass helps at least hold the surface of the soil together. Another approach is to put in a creek bed and put rock in, like in the lower left, for erosion control. And one approach I kind of like is the one in the lower right. This actually is a blend of rocks and plants. It's hard to see the rock and the swale here, but there's a drainage swale that collects the runoff from the downspouts of this house. It's got a river rock channel, and then it was interplanted with sedges and iris that like the moist conditions in the channel, and then they help anchor the rock into place. So that's a really nice approach for residential applications, sort of trying to mimic what we saw Mother Nature doing in the stream channel, of blending plants and rock to resist the erosive forces of moving water. One or two more points on drainage channels. If you do have to build a swale through your yard or a creek bed or a channel of some sort to convey water from one point to the other, first point is you want the channel to be U-shaped so that the water stays in the middle. If you fill the channel all the way in with rock, eventually the rock will get plugged up with leaves and things, and then the water will go around the rock to the outside of the channel. So dish it out in the middle and make it U-shaped to keep the water flowing over the center of the rock. The other point is if it's on a steep slope versus a flat slope, you need bigger rock to keep the rock from moving. And there's no exact rule of thumb that I can give you here, but in general, flat little creek bed around the side of the house might be 2 or 3 inch rock. A steeper slope like this with a storm drain pipe coming out, this is actually 4 to 8 inch rock in this channel. And if you have a choice, if you're at the Lawn and Garden Center picking out a rock for your creek bed, heavier rock doesn't move as easy as light rock. So if there's 2 or 3 different types that look nice to you, pick them up and choose the heavier rock. It doesn't move as easy as the lighter weight rock does. Okay, so that's the basics of drainage and how stormwater moves through the landscape. So now let's shift our focus to talking about how you pick plants for stormwater projects in your yard or your neighborhood. And there's 2 things I'd like you to think about as you go about choosing plants for stormwater projects or drainage projects. One is planting zones, and the other is how the plant grows, whether it's a bunch grass or something that spreads. So planting zones and growth habit are the two keys to picking native plants for drainage projects. This is a pond, a stormwater detention pond actually, and you can pretty clearly see there are different planting zones along the banks of ponds and lakes, right? At the bottom, we have standing water. So in the water, you have emergent plants, bulrushes and arrowheads. At the very top edge, the water never gets up there, so you can plant sort of dry prairie type species up here. And then halfway up the sides is intermediate conditions. When it rains and the water level in the pond goes up, the side slopes will get wet for a while. When the water goes down, it'll dry out. So you tend to pick plants for the side slopes that like moist conditions but can tolerate drying out between storm events. So you can see, even though this is a stormwater pond, there are 3 or 4 different planting zones just up the bank. Now, on a smaller scale, think about a rain garden for, say, a home project or this parking lot. Now, a rain garden is simply a garden with a dished out center. Usually they're only about 6 inches deep. It's sort of the opposite of a raised bed garden. It's a lowered bed garden designed to catch stormwater runoff from, say, a downspout that's collecting water coming off your roof. Or in this case, it's collecting drainage that's coming off the parking lot. In the case of the rain garden, we're catching the water, ponding it temporarily for 8, 12, 24 hours, and letting it soak into the ground where it belongs. We pick plants in the middle that like moist conditions, but can tolerate drying out between storm events. And then on the edges, we pick plants that generally like average to dry conditions. Sort of like the pond example, but not nearly as extreme range of water conditions that you see in a pond edge or lake edge like that. Does that make sense? Different planting zones for different locations where water collects. Now, here's the importance of how the plant grows and its shape, the growth habit of the plant. Bunch grasses are clump-forming plants. On the left are sedges, which quite often tend to form tussocks or mounds, and they take a long time to fill in the gaps between them for moist conditions on the left. Or some of our very attractive prairie grasses, like little blue stem on the right, beautiful grass, but it's a bunch grass. So they are clump-forming plants is their growth habit. Now back to the rain garden, the water that comes off the parking lot here fills up the garden and then it sits there quietly. So it's not flowing through the garden at a high rate of speed, so we don't have a lot of erosion concerns. So in this type of application, the clump forming plants work out just fine. So in this garden in the bottom, we put things like soft rush, sedges, blue lobelia, cardinal flower, blue flag iris, moist loving stream bank edge type plants in the bottom. And then on the sides, we can put things that are typically considered for drier locations. Little blue stem coneflowers, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, things like that. Now, I did this project several years ago. I've changed my approach in more recent years. Now I plant much more densely in my rain gardens, largely to suppress weeds. But the point here is the bunch forming plants are okay if the water is not flowing through at a high rate of speed where you have to worry about erosion. In a garden like this, the only place you'd really worry about erosion is on the back edge where the water drains off the parking lot into the garden. We did eventually get some erosion gullies down the side slopes there, and then ended up coming back and putting some river rock where the water drained down the side slopes. But that was the only place we really needed to worry about the erosion in this sort of situation. Now, if you are concerned about erosion, there's several things you can do. One is to plant very densely, put the plants close together. Pick plants that will fill in the gaps between the bunch forming plants. On the left here, the iris are spreading in around the sedges. On the right are bunch grasses. There is both a drop seed and blue stem in the picture on the right. And between it, the gaps has been filled in by smaller grasses, buffalo grass, as well as black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers and coreopsis and some other things that spread in to fill the gaps between the bunch grasses. So if you're concerned about erosion, you need to plant really densely to fill in the gaps between the plants. Another approach to dealing with erosion is to choose plants that spread aggressively, such as switchgrass and river oats. Now, there's pros and cons to using these types of plants. Since they spread aggressively, they might not be appropriate for very small yards. But if you say have a larger hillside or something, the fact that these plants spread by rhizomes and root runners, they spread pretty quickly. And as you can see on the river oats, they put out a lot of seed, so they can fill in the gaps quite quickly. But again, there are limitations to where you want to use plants that are known to be aggressive spreaders like this. And then when it comes to flowers, the ones that put out tons of seed are black-eyed Susans, the rudbeckias, the coreopsis, the asters, coneflowers, monarda, things like that put out tons of seeds, are really good for filling in gaps between the bunch grasses and helping control erosion over time. The shortcoming you have to plan for, though, is it takes several years to fill in the bare spaces. So you need to mulch good in the interim to prevent erosion on slopes while the plants are growing in. This happens to be the side slope of a rain garden that's collecting the runoff from the parking lot there. The garden, its bed itself, the low point is down the lower left of the corner here. Okay, checking the time, we're doing pretty good here. So those are the tools in your landscaping toolbox for dealing with stormwater drainage. One is to think about how water moves through the landscape. Think about how Mother Nature manages water and try to mimic that in your projects. And then think about what types of plants would be appropriate for the kinds of drainage problems that we tend to face in our suburban and urban environment. So I'm going to run through some examples here, and hopefully these give you some ideas for your own yards as you look to deal with your drainage issues. So the basic question we're trying to deal with is, how do we manage stormwater in the urban environment to make it behave more like the prairie or the forest? And there's three approaches. It's you catch and conserve water. Instead of letting it just run down the driveway in the street, catch it and save it for a dry day. Slow it down so it doesn't cause erosion. Soak it into the ground to save soil moisture. And then where you do have to deal with flowing water through your yard, deliberately control where the water flows so you prevent erosion. So it'd be catch, slow, and control would be the keys to managing drainage in the urban environment. So catching water, the key is to try to catch it as near the source as possible, right at your downspout. On the left is rain barrels. We've got 3 of them daisy chained together on one corner of our house. So we get about 150 gallons of water in a good rainstorm. So that water never hits the ground during the rainstorm. We save it to water our plants. It's soft water. It doesn't have chlorine in it. The plants love it. Sometimes in the summer, I will hook up a drip hose to it and water around the foundation of my house when the soil starts to dry out from the rain barrels. Another approach is the rain garden. On the right, where water runs off our driveway, we catch it in the rain garden here. We have a variety of sedges in there, the Michigan lilies, some phlox around the edge. What we do is we catch the water that runs off the driveway, slow it, and soak it back into the ground where it belongs. That saves the rainwater for later in the summer by building up soil moisture in the spring and using the soil itself as a sponge to hold the water. So we're slowing and soaking there as well. Another approach to slow and soak is simply to reduce the amount of turf grass in your lawn if you don't need it. If you've got little kids running around who need space to play soccer and things like that, great. But if you don't need so much turf grass, and you can start reducing it by putting trees back in, putting prairie plantings around the edges, you can see the two pictures on the right, you would expect a lot less water to run off these yards than you would the house on the left. Trees are a beautiful thing in hot summer as well, provide shade and cooling for your house. The notion of controlling the flow is illustrated in these photos. This is a school project done by a Boy Scout. The before picture is the upper left. The water that came off the roof and the concrete sidewalk at the top. You can see where it was carving a gully through this beautifully landscaped planting bed in the upper left. So it was just gouging a gully down the hillside. You can see where the water wanted to run. So when we helped the scout redo the landscape here with natives, the first thing we did was turn that gully into a creek bed to control the erosion where the water wanted to run. And then we put our natives in around the creek bed. So the creek bed was controlling the flow and preventing erosion, and then we planted around it. Here's another common problem in a lot of homes is water in the basement. So if you have a wet basement, there's several things you want to consider. The first thing is making sure your yard slopes away from the house, not towards it. And this is where the difference of even a couple inches can affect whether the water in your yard drains towards or away from your house. You know, I'd like to have 2 or 3 or 4 inches of slope away from the house, as shown in the picture of the triangle there. And then the second issue is the downspout hidden behind Mary here, who's praying that water doesn't soak into the basement. Is a lot of times you will see the downspout discharges right next to the foundation. So all the water that comes off the roof lands on the ground right up against the foundation wall and drains down the wall into the basement area. So the second thing to do is extend the downspout away from the house, at least several feet, to get the water moving out away from the foundation. A couple other considerations if you have a wet basement. Oftentimes you will see settling around the foundation because when the house was built, a trench was excavated to pour the basement foundation, and then it was backfilled where the planter bed is here. And over time, that area that had previously been excavated tends to settle. So some years later, as the planting bed there settles, then the slope starts aiming towards the house. And the other thing to consider is if you think back to the picture I showed you at the beginning of the road cut with the bedrock in the hillside, if there is a hill near your house or you're at a lower point in the neighborhood and there's uphill slopes above you, you can actually have groundwater moving in your direction. So even if you have your downspout pointed away from the house, and even if your yard is sloped away from the house, in some cases, people do have to have sump pumps because they can get groundwater, shallow groundwater, if the landscape in the neighborhood is sloped such that some of the hillside is draining in your direction. Just something to keep in mind, that sometimes water in basements can indeed be shallow groundwater. Now here's my favorite $5 garden tool for helping determine the slope of your yard. This is a string level, the close-up on the right. It's just a little bubble level with a couple hooks on it that hang on a string. So if your yard is pretty flat and you can't tell by eyeballing it which direction it slopes, you put a couple stakes in across the yard, tie a string to the stakes tightly, move one end up or down until the bubble is level, like you see in the left picture. And now that string is level, and it makes it easier to see which way the yard slopes. Or you can actually get out a yardstick or a tape measure and measure the distance. So this is a quick and cheap way to help determine the slope of your yard if it's hard to tell just by looking at it. Then once you get the water moving away from your house, where you can, try to slow it down and soak it in with a rain garden. This is a project a friend of mine in Minnesota did that I kind of like. You can see how there's some drainage challenges here. Fortunately, the paver sidewalk here drains away from the house towards the street. The neighbor's yard looks like it probably drains down onto his paver sidewalk. And then they put a rain garden in here out by the end of the sidewalk, and to get water into it, the close-up, you can see they pulled out some of the pavers and put a little creek bed across the sidewalk. I thought that was a very clever idea. But this shows that they're getting the water away from the house, the slope is away from the house, and they're making a conscious effort to catch some of the storm water and put it to good use by watering a garden here. Here's another yard with a downspout drain that comes out in the side yard. In this case, the yard is sloped. So the question is, how would we put a rain garden here? How would we dig a garden down into the slope? And the answer is we don't. We instead build the garden bed up. And so what we did in this yard, we built a shallow retaining wall, only about 12 or 15 inches high. And we put the rain garden behind the retaining wall. This photo also illustrates how I will use a string level to help lay out, say, a garden bed or a garden wall. The top of the wall is the top of the string. The rope along the bottom illustrates where the retaining wall will go. And we use this to help visualize what the garden perimeter might look like when we're done for the homeowner. And at the end of the day, this is what we constructed. They had several existing limestone walls in the yard, so we just mirrored and matched them. We built up this little retaining wall out of the limestone blocks, a natural limestone, created a garden space behind it, put a nice rich organic soil in, and planted it with moist tolerant plants, lobelia, blue flag iris, spiderwort, some sedges, soft rush, purple coneflowers around the edges. And when it fills up with water, it looked like this. It did not hold water long at all because that stacked limestone wall just let the water seep out and then spread out across the yard. So this would actually dry out in a couple hours after a rainstorm. Another common issue, the low spot in the backyard where the water ponds and you can't get the grass to grow. Perfect place for a rain garden. This is an example of a rain garden that collects drainage off a sidewalk and patio and roof and gives the water a space to drain away. It's only about 6 inches deep. But the key point here, you can see along the front edge of the sidewalk, is the garden is a couple inches lower than the sidewalk. So it allows the water that puddles on the sidewalk, gives it a place to drain away. And this is actually very helpful in winter, that it helps reduce icing on the sidewalk because you have positive drainage off the sidewalk. Sometimes what you see in typical situations that has turf next to sidewalks is over time, as the turf grows up and the thatch grows up, the water can't drain off the sidewalk and it leads to ponding on the sidewalk, which can lead to icing in the winter. So this is actually a bit of a safety feature too, to give the water a nice controlled place to drain off the sidewalk. If you do have a wet basement and a sump pump, where the sump pump water comes out and you have a wet spot in your yard, great place for a rain garden again. Sedges and irises and cardinal flower, blue lobelia. I think there's some coreopsis on the edge of this garden as well. This is a rain garden that we just constructed last fall over in Kansas City, Kansas, the KC Farm School at Gibbs Road, a nice volunteer organization that works on food security issues on that side of town. It was just planted, so the plants are small here, but the drainage from the little parking area and the driveway here used to puddle right in the corner of the lawn there. And so we took out some lawn, lowered the elevation about 6 inches, gave the water a place to drain into. And here's the plant list, things that like moist conditions in the middle and dry conditions on the edge. And what you don't see in this photo is this is just uphill of an orchard. So by collecting and conserving water and slowing it and soaking it into the ground, we retain soil moisture that slowly moves through the soil during dry periods for the nearby orchard. So it's a watering tool for the orchard as well. Instead of just letting the water drain off quickly down the landscape, we catch it, slow it, soak it into the ground to save it for a dry day. Narrow yards, if your house is real close to the neighbors and your downspouts come out, several approaches. Here's one where they just put a rock channel between the houses to collect the downspout drainage, moved it to the backyard to get it away from the house and foundation, and then let it go into a small rain garden out in back of the house. But the key here was they did not want to be soaking water into the ground in a rain garden right next to the foundation. So they conveyed it away from the house first before they slowed it down in a rain garden. And here is a very narrow yard. This is Philadelphia, one of our work projects, row houses that actually have no side yards. We experimented by putting rain gardens in planter boxes. And this is essentially a rain garden built into a rain barrel. We designed these planter boxes, lined them with a plastic liner. There's a gravel under drain in the bottom, sort of like in an aquarium tank with a drain pipe behind it. And then we rerouted the downspout into the planter box. It waters the planter box. A portion of the water is retained in the planter box. And then we were slowing the flow that previously just went out onto the sidewalk. And that was kind of a fun project, something unique, try something different on how to take advantage of the stormwater that comes off the roof to water the plants there. Okay, something quite different here. If your yard looks like this means half the neighborhood's draining through your yard. A friend of mine here, David, a bunch of water drains through part of his yard. He has a detached garage and workspace there. Fortunately, his foundation is elevated a couple feet above the low point in the yard. There's so much water coming through when the neighbor's yard and the neighbor's yard drains through yours. Simply putting a rain garden in wouldn't solve this because there's too much water moving through the yard. In this case, you really just have to route the water through the yard safely and either have a dense vegetated swale or a creek bed to move the water around. and let it pass through down into the woods, into the low area without causing problems for the building. Now, the other issue here is all the mud you see in the waters because there was a construction project going on upstream and they had no erosion control. So that's the point at which you call the city public works department and ask them to enforce their erosion control ordinances on the development properties upstream. So if you do have muddy water flowing through your yard, that's the time when you can call the city and ask them to send an inspector out for the upstream construction projects. So when you have problems like this, where your yard is at the bottom of the hill, it's often not something that you can simply solve just by putting a rain garden in. Neighborhood scale drainage problems like this either require cooperation of everybody in the neighborhood to try to slow the water coming out of their yards, or you need to route the water through your yard, either in a channel or in the upper photo here. What they ended up doing was putting a drain pipe around the house, and they had to put a yard drain in the back of the yard. Then they could plant around the yard drain. But when water puddles like this, then you have to find a way to move it around the house safely. A nice picture here from another friend up in Minnesota of a neighborhood common space. The drainage swales behind the buildings was densely planted. This is a much nicer way to move water through a neighborhood and slow it down, soak it into the ground. To be honest, I don't know if this was a homes association initiative or a community initiative, but this is a nice way to use common area drainage spaces in neighborhoods. Couple more slides and then we'll get to questions here shortly. A couple special considerations. If you have a stream that runs through your property and the stream bank is eroding, this is a much more complex issue because often you can get very high flow velocities that cause a lot of erosion. So typically when we are trying to stabilize eroded stream banks, we really need to integrate rocks and plants together. The large rocks at the toe of the bank help prevent erosion. And then we try to plant densely around it to stabilize the slope up above the rock toe and help hold the rock together. Out in the sunny areas, we often use a lot of the prairie species that have very dense fibrous root mats. And in the shaded areas, you use those native plants that tend to like these types of locations. 9-bark is a bomb-proof plant with really dense root systems, gray dogwoods, gooseberries, things like that that you normally find in our riparian locations around here. And last one here, this was a neighborhood pond, a small lake in a neighborhood. Clearly from the color of the water, there's some issues here. They had terrible algae blooms from the lake filling in over time and nutrient problems in the lake. That's one issue they're dealing with. But in this location, you can see the lake shore is very narrow right up against a roadway that runs around the pond. And they were having erosion problems all down the side slope here. So they were looking for a way to use native plants to stabilize this embankment. And they had very little resources and money. They did manage to get a small county stormwater grant to pay for plants. But to hold the bank together, they worked with available materials in the neighborhood. The rock that they used to line the lowest part of the channel here was from a fallen retaining wall that one neighbor donated, and a couple trees had come down in the neighborhood that they cut up into the logs that you see here. So I was very impressed with how they were innovative in working with what materials they had in hand to try to control erosion here. So the things they did was they terraced the embankment a little bit. And we do know that in several years, the logs will decay and rot away, but hopefully in that time, the plants are grown in. So they terraced the slope with the logs. They scrounged some rocks to line the lowest point where the major drainage was. And then they densely planted the banks with both plugs and seeds, following our planting zones that we discussed earlier. They have some emergent plants down right along the toe. Then partway up the bank where it was wet to moist is where they put the sedges and the river oats. And then as you get up closer to the top, they put the drier loving prairie type species. So a nice example here of working with what you have to work with and thinking about the planting zones that are appropriate for the location. And so to wrap up, if we come back to this house that I've been picking on throughout the presentation, and we were going to now turn this into an environmentally sensitive yard and a water-wise yard, what kinds of things might we do here? So we want to catch and collect stormwater, we want to slow and soak it, and we want to control how the water moves through the yard, right? So the first thing we do is get rid of these fake shrubs out here and replace them with native plants, of course. We might put some rain barrels on the corner of the house to collect some of the runoff from the roof. The downspout in the front yard, and especially the downspouts by the driveway, which right now just direct drainage out the driveway, we'd redirect them to a rain garden in the yard to catch and soak the water into the ground. We might put some more trees in for summer shade and cooling. And then over time, you can even improve how well water infiltrates into compacted lawns by aerating them once a year and top dressing them with compost. Over the course of several years, you can improve the infiltration rates just by working on improving the soil in the yard. So that's the types of things we might do on a very typical suburban lot here to make it pollinator friendly and water wise at the same time. For reference, at the end of the presentation here, I have 3 slides with some plant recommendations. I'm not going to go through each individual plant. But how this is laid out, the blue bars on the left show you the moisture conditions that the plants like. The yellow bars on the right show you the sunshade conditions, and then we've got some notes on each. So for example, palm sedge here, one of my favorite sedges because it tolerates a wide range of moisture and sun conditions. It is a very good all-purpose drainage plant. Several other sedges, we have some notes here that they really need more moist conditions. They won't tolerate drying out like the palm sedge will. So for each of the plants, you'll see those kinds of notes on moisture preferences and some of their growth habits. So there's some sedges, grasses, some flowers, a few trees and shrubs that you can refer back to for reference. And here are several very nice resources. Of course, the first place to start is at Deep Roots. Tons of information on the Deep Roots website. All things native plants in the Midwest, and lots of great presentations and webinars for viewing, as you've seen. 3 references here for strictly stormwater applications. The Rain Garden book, if you're specifically interested in rain gardens, that's one you can pick up. Terrace Horticultural Books here is one place to get it. It is available generally in the Kansas City area at half-price bookstores because I've done a lot of rain garden workshops over the years, and over time you see it starting to show up in some of the used bookstores. The Plants for Stormwater Design book on the right is a free PDF download from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This was written by my rain garden co-authors. excellent, excellent resource. Just do a Google search for plants for stormwater design and you'll get the link. It's got dozens and dozens of plants in there with specific information on how much water each type of plant can tolerate, as well as native plant habitat information, habitat and pollinator value as well. Great, great resource for stormwater projects. And then the Blue Thumb Partners website here in the lower right is a nonprofit based out of Minnesota as well that helped sponsor our rain garden book. As opposed to Green Thumb, their moniker is Blue Thumb, Planting for Clean Water. They have nice information on their website on shoreline plantings, alternative lawns, as well as some videos on how to build rain gardens if you'd like. Good all-around resource that would, not all the plants are the same as we have here in the Kansas City area, but there's a pretty good overlap. And then I'm not going to show you all these right now, but I'll let you know that there's 18 or 20 slides at the end with photos of the plants that are in the previous list that I showed you. So this is a reference that'll be available for you on the Deep Roots website. So some of my favorite plants, you'll see information like this, showing a picture of the plant and some of its characteristics. So with that, Sarah, I've used up almost the whole hour. I apologize. I'll stop sharing my screen here and see if you want to squeeze in some questions and answers, even though I ran a little bit late here.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll do a few. I know some folks may need to go ahead and hop off, and that's perfectly all right. Feel free to check the recording later for the Q&A, but we'll take a few here. So one that caught my eye, would you talk about the sorcery on your rain barrels? The question is, how does water flow from one rain barrel to the next? You show the connections at the bottom of the barrel. So will you
oh, yeah,
enlighten us on that?
Thank you very much. Let me flip back to that picture. Hope I don't make you dizzy flipping through the photos here. We're getting there. Whoop, there we are. Okay, so what happens? Do you see my cursor, Sarah, or do I just have to talk through it?
No, I believe we can. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so the water comes down the downspout, fills up the first barrel, and as the water, and they're connected at the bottom through hose bibs, and they are all open. So as the water goes up in this first barrel, the height of the water in that barrel pushes the water down the hose, which fills up the second barrel and fills up the third barrel. They fill from the bottom. And so the benefit of this is that once all three of them are filled, if I were to hook a garden hose to one of them, I would get the water out of all three barrels because the water level is going up and down, connected at the bottom. If we did it differently and the water filled up, then we had a pipe that went over into the second barrel. And then once that filled up, a pipe went over into the third barrel. Actually, the second and third barrel would have to be lower than the first one for the water to get into it. But believe it or not, as funny as this looks, it works out really slick because once the water starts going up in the first one, it causes the water pressure in that one causes the water to rise up in the other two because they're connected together by these hoses.
Thanks. It makes sense. It's just not at all what you're sort of used to seeing. So thanks for going over that. Anita asks, in the example that you talked about where you have a mixture of rocks and plants in the drainage channel, how do you plant once the rocks are installed?
Oh, okay. Actually, we could use this one as an example, Anita. Some people will put weed mat under their creek beds. Other people do not. There's different schools of thought on that. It depends how you like dealing with weeds. But for the purpose of your question, I'm going to assume maybe you put weed mat under it. So you create the channel, your U-shaped channel, you dig it out, put your weed mat down, line it with rock. And then when I decide where I want to put my plants, I will pull out 3 or 4 rocks, cut a hole in the weed mat, and then plant, and then gently nudge the rocks back into place or use some smaller rocks to fill in. So I build the channel first, and then I pull out rocks once I decide where I want to put the plants in. And then I let the plants fill in between the rocks.
Thanks. Sherry asks, do you have recommendations for Missouri native plants that will establish deep roots very quickly? She's interested in establishing a patch that will hold the soil as soon as possible.
Deep roots quickly. If it is a moist location, my go-to plant, Sherry, is palm sedge. Let me think. For dry locations, I tend to use a mixture of some of our very common prairie plants. The blue stems, it all depends on how big your patch is and what size plants you want. I work with little blue stem a lot. The cone flowers there actually grow pretty quickly, put down a deep tap root. It takes a while to really grow the deep roots. If I'm trying to hold a bank in place, I am generally more concerned about things that will fill in quickly to prevent erosion. Coreopsis, black-eyed Susans, those sorts of things put out a lot of seeds. The rudbeckias, the asters that will fill in the gaps quickly and then allow more time for the roots to grow down. If you're looking at shrubs, my go-to shrub, my wife's go-to shrub, I should clarify if she's listening, is 9-bark. Big deep root systems, sun, shade, wet, dry, good all-round shrub. In the tree department, takes quite a while for most of the tree roots to get established. So unless I'm specifically looking for trees, I generally work with the prairie species to hold embankments in first. River oats establishes very fast, but as noted earlier, it is quite invasive. So you have to decide whether or not you can tolerate the invasives, the aggressiveness of it, not invasiveness.
And I think we'll do one more, it looks like. That comes from Val. What is your advice on maintaining against weeds?
In the creek bed, I sometimes will put down weed mat. In most of my plantings, I do 2 things, Val. One is I plant very densely, so the plants fill in. If we're looking at this photo, for example, there's lots of space here for weeds to fill in around the upper left photo. So I plant very densely. As I talk, I'm going to see if there's an example here. This rain garden, we could go even more dense than what you see here. And then I mulch heavily. I'll put down maybe 3 inches of shredded mulch in my rain gardens to help keep the weeds down until the plants fill in the gap. So it's a 2-prong attack. Heavy mulch to begin with, plant densely, and then let the natives shade out the weeds over time as they grow in.
And then just my own follow-up there. Are you re-mulching as you go on, or just letting the plants fill in and have that be good?
In a garden like this, I would probably re-mulch for a couple years because it's going to take 2 to 3 years for these to really fill in. And if you look on the left side, there's kind of big gaps between the plants. And in the middle, they're closer together. And you can imagine over here on the left, it's going to be more prone to weeds at first, right? And then So I'll remulch for a couple years probably to help keep the weeds down. And then by year 3, a lot of our natives, especially if you're going with potted plants or plugs, by year 3, they can be pretty well established and doing a good job of filling in the gaps, and they can cut back on the mulch.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation this evening. David, it's been great to have you here, really informative. And again, we'll have the recording available as well as the slides. I know you've got a lot of additional information that will be valuable to folks once they have a chance to take a look at the details on those slides as well.
Okay, cool. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me tonight, and thank you all for sharing your dinner hour with us.
A pleasure as always to have you here, and I love the dinner and a show. It's fantastic. So I would like to encourage everyone after we wrap up this evening to please visit deeproots.org. As I mentioned, you can see all of our previous webinars, learn more about native plants and where to buy them. And within a day or so, we'll have the recording of tonight's webinar up there as well, along with a link to the slides. While you're there, we would deeply appreciate your support of our ongoing education series and efforts around native plants. You'll find the donate button in the top right corner of your page. And we hope to see you next time on May 11th. We'll have a webinar on native garden maintenance with Matt Bunch. So hope to see you back here in 2 weeks' time for that. And that's all I have for this evening. Thanks again, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.